Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to another episode of the Coach Cody podcast. Today I have a returning special guest, Austin Stout, and today we're going to talk about fat loss and adaptations, and who doesn't want to learn more about fat loss? So, welcome, Austin. How's it going?
Oh, it's going. Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
and also forgot if anyone wants to know more about Austin, he did come on to a previous episode. If you want to check that out, we talked about gut health, which is also really good stuff in there. So go there first, and then come back here, or you go backwards. It doesn't really matter. But yeah, so fat loss, adaptations. Where would you like to start?
So I guess the first thing we should probably do is talk about like what does that mean and what are they and how do they occur? That type of thing.
Yeah.
Because in a perfect world, I suppose that you would take away calories and then just lose body fat or lose weight indefinitely
Yeah.
until you decided you wanted to be done.
Yeah.
Right? So the theory would be, you create your calorie deficit and then you just continue to drop body fat. And once you're happy with where you're at, you can add some calories back in. But that doesn't happen. And there's a whole host of adaptations that can happen both both like physiologically, psychologically, even environmentally, I guess would be maybe a way to phrase it. So the first thing, and the people that have been around a long time maybe remember the term metabolic damage. That was the term people started using. That got thrown out pretty quick. That's not an accurate term. So we'll call it metabolic adaptation. So if we're looking at it metabolically or hormonally, there's a few different adaptations that will occur primarily. One is going to be reduce thyroid hormone conversion. So your conversion from T4 to your active thyroid hormone T3, that conversion rate generally goes down. And that's partially from food restriction. It can be from like the general stress of the diet, I guess, if you will, the fat loss. Like obviously the more severe it is, the more that's going to go up. And then some of that T4 will be converted into reverse T3, which is just an inactive form of T3. The other downside to that is reverse T3 has the ability to occupy T3 receptors. So not only is it not active, but it can actually take up some of the space for the good stuff, right? So that's why that's why we might measure something like that in labs. And that's also why sometimes you'll even see that marker elevated outside of a calorie deficit, right? When stress is high.
Yeah.
So that's one. That's a common one. We also know that leptin levels go down. So this is a fat burning hormone. It's kind of what we consider a fat burning hormone. It works in conjunction with ghrelin, which is kind of what would be considered like our primary hunger hormone or one of them. And they kind of do this push and pull system to regulate hunger, metabolic rate, satiety, like how quickly you get full and things like that. If anyone here has ever gotten really lean, they know afterwards you can eat till you're full but still be hungry. Anyone?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Well, that's an adaptation because really, or maybe you've even been in the diet or in the prep and and the floodgate opened a little bit and you couldn't stop. One of those situations, a binge,
Mm-hmm.
that type of thing. And that's because the body's is dysregulated. Those levels are dysregulated. It's like intentionally trying to regain body fat, right? It's trying to regain homeostasis. So what happens with those hormones is when you decrease calories, leptin levels go down, especially when body fat goes down, leptin levels will go down, and then ghrelin levels probably are going to go up,
Yeah.
right? So you get hungrier, your metabolism, I guess, if you will, kind of like slows down your basal metabolic rate. Now, there's arguments as far as like how much does that actually happen. You'll see some percentages thrown around. I mean, there's some research on it. So there's some numbers available. We know it's genetically it's going to vary person to person. Some people, you take away calories and they'll lose body fat or weight on the same calorie deficit for a really long time, and then other people require more frequent adjustments,
Hmm.
right? So like people adapt a lot different depending on metabolism, and also genetics play into that big time. Um, even even like epigenetic adaptations where you've been exposed to like a certain environment for a really long time, maybe as like a protective mechanism, right? So there's a lot of things that can play into that. Now, you can also see the flip side of that where people that get really, really overweight become leptin resistant, and their ghrelin, so their leptin and ghrelin are out of balance. So it's interesting because theoretically, if you were really overweight, you should never be hungry, right?
Yeah.
And you should have a high metabolic rate theoretically. But you ever watch My 600 Pound Life? They're always hungry. You're like, how can you be that big and that hungry?
Yeah. For
There's
sure.
this there's a point where you're kind of getting resistant to the hormones. So even though they might be there, they're not doing what they should be, because the receptors are resistant to them. Like it's like insulin resistance. There can be a truckload of insulin there, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily that the cells are sensitive to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that can happen. So like leptin, ghrelin, those things. There's a few other, there's a few other smaller things that go into that as far as hormonally. Not really metabolic per se, but we know sex hormones can drop with that if you're somebody that's not supported by exogenous hormones, whether it's like HRT or taking other exogenous hormones, those levels are probably dropped in females and males. I mean, we see it. There's plenty of research on it. Pretty much every guy that does a contest prep or gets very lean naturally will be hypogonadal at the end.
Yeah.
Mainly, mostly all of them. Now, of course, how much that happens really depends on like how far you go and like maybe what was your starting point to begin with. Are you naturally lean? Here's the easiest way to probably think of adaptations for most people is the further you get away from your natural baseline, the more likely those things are going to happen. So if you are naturally pretty lean, you might be able to get leaner, but still only be 10% away from your natural baseline. But if you're someone that's not like that naturally, that might be quite, even though you get the same condition as the other person, that might be quite a big discrepancy from baseline.
Yeah.
So you're getting further and further away, just like muscle gain, it gets harder. If you're naturally real small, maybe it could be hard to get real big, right? So if you're naturally really big, you probably have a better chance of getting bigger. So that's kind of easy way to think about it. Now there are other like we'll call it kind of environmental adaptations and things that happen too. So for example, neat levels. I mean, that's a big one that everyone's talked about over the last several years. That's why step counting became so big. I probably would attribute steps to neat, and that's probably how that cardio modality started, because the idea was that you could do 30 minutes of walking on the treadmill every day, but what if all of your other energy expenditure outside of that dropped because you got really tired and you weren't moving? So doing a step goal was a way to make that a little more accurate. Now, when I say that, don't get me wrong, plenty of people get really lean doing time cardio, so don't freak out. If that's what you're doing, it's totally fine. I mean, it can work. It's just that realize sometimes you could be doing more of that to offset some of what you're not doing,
Yeah.
right? And then also within that, we wear our watches or our Aura rings or Whoop bands and all these things, and there's other micro movements that probably don't get tracked in there. Are you tapping your feet? Are you moving? Like, what are you doing? That's neat,
Yeah.
right? That's neat level. So it's non-exercise activated thermogenesis. So it's like, or activity thermogenesis. So theoretically, the steps still aren't perfect. There's other things that you could be doing less of. So regardless, unless you're somehow consciously doing everything the same, you're probably going to see a lower NEAT levels. And I would also argue if you are consciously doing everything the same, you're probably neurotic to an extreme degree, and that's probably and it's probably going to do you more harm than good. Like if you're thinking they're like, I got to tap my foot, I got to tap my foot. Um, Probably not good. But so NEAT's going to go down probably. Um, Other things are you become more cardio. I would say like cardio adapted or cardio efficient even. So for example, or you could say that the activity that you do burns less than it did before. So a couple examples of that would be if you weigh 200 pounds and you do 10,000 steps versus you lose 40 pounds and you do 10,000 steps at 160 pounds. That's a lot less weight moving through space.
Yeah.
So naturally, you're going to burn less calories right off their bat. So, people are like, I can wear a weighted vest. And I've seen people do it. I've seen people like when they lose weight, they add weight to their vest, and that's how they keep that consistent. I personally don't suggest that. I think that's probably just a recipe for some bad, disordered uh, behaviors, but it could work. Um, you probably, to some extent, and again, science people don't rip me on this, but probably to some extent, you also become more cardio efficient because your respiration rate and stuff goes down, like resting heart rate and all that. So, for example, if you ran a mile and a trained marathon runner ran a mile, and you guys were exactly the same size, who do you think would burn more calories? Probably you.
Yeah, not the marathon runner.
Well, they're very efficient, so they might be efficient in a couple ways. Their strides, like their gait pattern, the way that they're executing the running, and you're like, I don't really run, so I'm like a giraffe. So that could be one. Or it's the fact that their resting heart rate's pretty low
Yeah.
already, and their respiration rate's low, and they're super efficient at breathing and all that stuff. So that's probably another adaptation that occurs in terms of movement adaptation. I'm sure there's some I'm leaving out. I mean, those are kind of, I mean, to me, those are probably the biggest adaptations that you see. And of course, you could put training into that. I mean, training obviously burns calories, so
Yeah.
you're not really doing training for calorie burning. Probably it's probably for more muscle retention or hypertrophy or something. But if you get lean enough, you're probably going to get weaker.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's a factor, and especially you probably just don't have the same recovery ability, so you might have to lower your volume a little bit even, so like you're doing less of that stuff. So you could throw that in there. That's like an honorable mention, I suppose.
Yeah.
So
I I think it's funny because like when we think of metabolism slowing or adaptations, people don't think of it just like separate from what they're physically doing. It's just like a lot of subconscious things that we aren't aware of that you know you're adapting to, like you mentioned, like tapping your foot or in prep, like even talking slower, like it just
right.
starts to happen. It's just your body's way
Yep.
of like trying to preserve energy and you're not even completely
Sitting,
aware of it. Was
sitting
that?
and standing, even.
Yes,
You know.
yeah.
So so I have a um, my fiance redid the bathroom, and she's like redecorating, and she put a chair in there. And I'm pretty deep into a deficit. I'm like, oh yeah, a chair. I could sit down and get dressed. Have to, like bend over, try to put my socks on, and but that's, I mean, I don't know that that's probably not going to be the thing that ruins any progress, but you do a lot of that stuff
Yeah,
probably. You
yeah,
know, you're just like, oh, I got to sit down,
yeah.
or even just the way that you bend over and pick stuff up because you're just like, I don't have the energy to bend over and put my shoe on anymore, so I'm just gonna stuff my foot in it while I stand up.
Yeah, exactly. And or even I know when I was like deep in prep last year, I was like using the railing going down my stairs,
Yeah,
just like
man.
little
So
things.
all of it. So
Yeah,
so the next, and that kind of and that does answer some of the questions as to like how do you how do you offset some of the adaptations? Well, one of the ways would be to try to maintain the NEAT level, right? That's a pretty effective way. It's not perfect, but it's something. I think that I try to tell people when you get tired, you have to manage fatigue, and maybe you're working with a coach and they have you do like do some a refeed here and there, or we can talk about that. Rest occasionally to kind of like dump some of the fatigue, things like that. But you should maybe just try to do the normal stuff that you typically do. So if you normally take the trash out, try to keep, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
doing the dishes, like if that's something that you're doing, maybe just try to continue to do that instead of not do anything and sit and do absolutely nothing as much as possible. Um, those things are pretty low impact. So it's not like it's just you don't want to do it because you're tired, but it's not like it's probably going to really cause a bunch of fatigue
Yeah.
necessarily. So that would be something. But when most people think of this, they're usually thinking about stuff like refeeding and cortisol and and all those things, and that's kind of where we can go into diet breaks, right? So now a couple caveats at the beginning. You probably don't need to do this stuff as much if you're not that lean or if you're very early in the process, because there's probably not that much adaptation yet,
Yeah.
you know, and that will vary person to person, and everyone has a different method, and, whatever. And it can, and hopefully if you're coaching people, you're not doing the same thing with everyone because they're not going to require the same thing. But those things can come into play. Now, we know some stuff about refeeding and diet breaks. There's some good research on it. If you're into that type of stuff, you can you could go into PubMed or one of those research databases and type in like overfeeding and, calorie restriction, like, tag words and stuff like that. And you can find some of it. So, kind of what we found is that the effect is not that big, actually, and B, it doesn't last for that long, and C, is the effect even big enough to offset the fact that you ate more? Good question to ask, right? Because if you eat, so let's say that you're normally eating 100 grams of carbs, and then you refeed on, I don't know, arbitrary number, let's say it's 300. Well, you increase carbs by 200, that's 800 calories. Are you going to burn an extra 800 calories from that? Now, your training performance might go up. It depends how far into like a prep or diet you are. Like if you're deep enough in there, it probably ain't going to do anything. You're probably still going to, you might get a little better pump, but you're probably not going to be that much better. But I would probably say in a lot of cases it's most likely not even gonna it's probably not even going to have enough of an effect to warrant a larger refeed. So the other things we know are, and I'm not saying refeeding shouldn't happen, I'll talk about why it might be helpful. The other things that we know are that time matters. So the more time that you are out of the deficit, the better, or I just say the better result you'll get against that adaptation. So some people started citing like 48 hours as a metric. You should refeed like 2 days perhaps. One day is probably still does something, but longer does more. And then people got into diet breaks, which you might define differently from person to person. But let's say that that's like, I don't know, 5 days or more. That might be, if you check in on a Monday, maybe it's from Monday till the following Monday or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
You know. Now the key, and we'll talk about structuring that stuff. The other key is to understand the other benefits that might come along with it, because there could be other reasons to do it. One is definitely going to be cortisol, we'll say cortisol modulation and neurochemicals like dopamine, serotonin, diet adherence, maybe psychological stuff like that. Now, that's a two-way street though, because I've also seen some people that they refeed and it has that kind of like, I think I'm going to binge. And they feel that.
Yeah.
They feel that. Again, it's like that floodgate thing kind of, it opens them up to that. And so you got to be careful because that might not be a good situation to put someone in. So you might have to reduce how big the refeed is, or maybe not do it at all, or structure it different, or something like that. But we do know that cortisol and insulin are inverse of each other, and we typically see like adding, and I'm talking about carbohydrates mainly. Like we add carbs, we'll see probably a drop in cortisol, a reduction in cortisol, and you might see an improvement in the physique because with that drop in cortisol, the adrenal gland activity is probably reducing. So when that happens, aldosterone level probably goes down also. So sodium and water retention will drop some. So you look tighter and probably fuller at the same time. I mean, just looking fuller alone might make you look tighter, maybe.
Yeah.
Depending on if you're lean enough and you can like visibly see that. So that's not a direct metabolic benefit, but it's probably helpful from a cortisol modulation standpoint to have little breaks in there to not let that run away, super high for a long time. And then you can throw in, of course, maybe it gives you a little bit of a boost in some of your neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, and you kind of like, all right, now I can hang on for another, 5 days or week or whatever, whatever it is. So that could be beneficial just for diet adherence. And I find that it's kind of person dependent, but anytime you're doing this stuff, one of the things that I've changed a lot over the years is how big the refeeds are and how I structuring them. So for example, I'm talking about that cortisol and fatigue. When you think about a refeed, really what you're doing is you're getting out of a calorie deficit. So you can do that through eating more, or you can do it through reducing calorie expenditure.
Yeah.
So you could make an argument in some cases that reducing calorie expenditure would maybe even be more beneficial because you're shifting the calorie balance and you're taking stress off the body at the same time.
Yeah.
So maybe for some people, or for a lot of people, you do that, or you do a little bit of both
Yeah.
at the same time. So rather than just being like, we're going to do a whole bunch of carbs, you might say, we're going to do a little bit of carbs. And when I say a little bit, I mean, that could vary again, person to person. Again, 50 carbs is 200 calories, and 50 carbs doesn't seem like that much. And you might do more than that, probably. But you could do more moderate amount of carbs, and then if the person's fatigue is really high or they're doing a lot of cardio, maybe there's someone that has to do a lot of cardio, maybe just reduce the amount of cardio. Could be half, could be none, and do your refeeding that way. And how hard, like how much you do that could depend on a what is your goal and timeline. If it's a contest prep, you have a timeline. So like if you're behind in prep, then you don't have a whole lot of days to waste. You might have to be like 1 or 2 days, you're in and out. If you're ahead and you do it and you start noticing like, oh, I look a little better, I look a little tighter, this is good, you can do more. I mean, you know what I mean? Like you can add more days. I suppose you could do that if you were behind too. Like if it's having a positive effect, you could do more, but timeline is still going to be a thing. Now, if you're a general population client and you're not on a timeline, you might benefit from doing kind of the low and slow approach, and maybe that's easier and you're less likely to binge or go off track and stuff. You might do something small and just do it for a week or 2 weeks, even in some cases, you know, and because there's not as much sense of urgency other than how patient is the person. So I might even have them do it for a week. When I see the next update, I'm like, all right, do you look better? How do you feel? Where's your weight? Like, how much effect did we get from that? I'm like, oh, you didn't gain any weight. You look a little bit better. You feel a little better. Let's do another week.
Yeah.
Positive, net positive. Oh, you gained 2 pounds. You did get some fatigue reduction. You're getting a little hungrier. Maybe metabolic rates going up a little bit. We got in. We're out. We're done. We're going to go back to the plan. And a question that I get asked a lot is about what do you do after that? Because a lot of the time, or we can talk about maybe why, like when would you do it? Because that's always a thing is some people might just use a refeeding cycle where it's like every seventh day or every 10th day or every fifth day. And that works. Don't get me wrong. People have been doing that since the beginning. But if you're a little more experienced, you can do it more on an as needed basis and a kind of by feel basis. The goal would be to try to do it before there's a big problem. Like
Yeah.
you're starting to see glimpses of the adaptation and the fatigue and the slowdown. Let's go ahead and hit it now
Yeah.
before things like really dig yourself in a hole. So you're noticing like, oh, weight loss pattern or fat loss pattern was 2 pounds a week. Now it's 1 pound a week. Now it's half pound. You lost like 2 ounces. We're slowing down. So the question now becomes, do we just reduce calories altogether to create a deficit or do we refeed first? So again, are you pretty lean? How's your fatigue? Do you have like, are you pretty far into the diet? Have you been doing it for a long time? The more chance, like those things we talked about at the beginning, the more of a position you're in to have those adaptations, the more beneficial that is going to become.
Yeah.
So then you might do it, or you might just say, nah, we've only made 1 calorie change and you lost weight on that for like 4 weeks. I'm just going to reduce calories again. Like clearly there's not that much adaptation.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Cool. Um, so as far as like the other way around, so once say you're at the end of prep and you reverse dieting and that sort of thing, so you've adapted to lower calories. So how might you go, the other direction to like adapt to higher calories?
so talking about transitioning out of that effectively,
Yeah.
dude. People are going to argue about this forever. The the I think most of the people that were very science based kind of did away with the idea of slow reverse dieting. I think most of them, just because what what we found is that in order to reverse adaptations, the adaptations that have occurred, whether it's hormonally, metabolically, whatever, it's not just calories. It's also body fat.
Yeah.
So what they find is that you probably have to regain enough body fat in order for those things to reverse. Because otherwise, if you just binged after the show and you got your calories up real quick, you'd be fine in a week. That doesn't happen. You can't go in there and do lab work and look at your testosterone levels and your thyroid levels and expect them to be fixed, because
Yeah.
they're not going to be fixed. Probably what's going to happen is you're going to get a little bit fuller and you get this crazy like sodium water pumps in the gym. You'll be nice and watery. And then about 3 or 4 weeks later, you'll be like, oh shit, I spilled over. And you start seeing it.
Yeah.
It starts becoming really visible because that's always what happens. They're like, I'm good, I'm good. Uh-oh. One day you wake up, you're like, I'm not good. So it always happens really, it's like overnight like that if it's not controlled. So yes, I agree I agree that probably the faster you can get back to baseline, the better. but probably need to consider psychology most heavily in that situation because you know, people are going to be afraid to regain body fat. I mean, they just were in this state for a really long time. Some people don't care. Some people are going to be really afraid. Some people are going to maybe even want to continue really restrictive activity, like really restrictive habits and stuff to try to offset that. And unfortunately, they're just not going to recover
Yeah.
very well. So, I mean, ideally, I'd try to go as fast as I can without it stressing the client out too much. Um, and like we talked about with the refeeding setup, that's calorie expenditure plus calories in intake.
Yeah.
And you can do it either way, but you probably want to look at like which of those is a priority. Maybe you're going to manipulate both, but maybe one is a little more of a priority than the other. For example, the calories aren't too low, but they're doing a lot of cardio, a lot of activity, very high fatigue. I might want to focus on that aspect a little bit more at the beginning and try to get some of that down and only make smaller increases to the calories. Maybe it's, 200, 300s, like something's reasonable and work it up that way. Or maybe it's the opposite. They're eating less, but their activity level's not that bad.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe food's going to be more of a focus. For the unfortunate people that have to do both, then probably gonna probably gonna try to get both of those things moving at kind of a similar pace. And with the activity, looking at the stuff that's going to be most taxing, because you could, if someone's like, for example, like if somebody's doing like interval cardio or something like HIIT cardio or interval cardio, that's way more systemically taxing than walking.
Yeah.
Walking is going to be taxing at some point if you're doing 25,000 steps a day or something, like, yeah, but you can walk. I mean, you can walk around quite a bit before it's going to be anywhere close to sprinting, as
Right.
far as as far as how stressful that's going to be on your body. So with the activity, it's kind of like looking at that. Even training's a factor. There's so many different methodologies when it comes to training after the show. A lot of people are like, take advantage of the, post show rebound and this and that. But the thing about that is, yeah, you're really insulin sensitive, but your fat cells are also really insulin sensitive too. So like everything's ready to
Yeah.
eat. So you might fill out. Like you definitely will fill out. But as far as accruing muscle tissue, most likely what's going to happen is you're going to quickly regain what little bit you lost
Yeah.
through the diet. Now, maybe you didn't lose any if you're not getting that lean, but if if you're really grinded out and got really contest lean, you might have lost a little bit.
Yeah.
It's probably not going to be that much. I mean, again, there is research and stuff on that, and it's usually not like as much as people think. And even the research on natural bodybuilders that had like no hormones, they
Yeah.
still didn't. And I think a lot of the original research was on and don't quote me on this. I know Dr. Peter Fitchin. I did some stuff with him, and I think he was part of that one of those original research. And there's some other ones, and that was done on pro natural bodybuilders, like getting peeled, you know,
Okay.
shredded glutes, like peeled, and and of course by the end of the prep, their testosterone's tanked, all that stuff's tanked. And even then, they weren't losing mass. I mean, it wasn't that much muscle mass. So, and I can't remember how they measured it, because you would lose lean body mass, because lean body mass could also be water, is like basically everything but fat, so like water, like glycogen, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But the actual muscle tissue wasn't that much. So when you do that, you're trying to rebound really quick. You're probably going to regain whatever you lost pretty quickly, and then you're going to start gaining muscle. But that's assuming that you have the actual hormonal environment to gain it.
Yeah.
Now, if you're on exogenous hormones, that might be a little bit more advantageous, but then you get into the argument of probably already been using that stuff for a while. You might not, you might want to be careful just continuing to do it.
Yeah.
Um, because really at the end of the day, when you're post diet, if you've gotten pretty lean, whether it's a show or not, you should be able to regain strength and increase training performance with very little effort.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people, they'll change their training in peak, like the peak week before the show and stuff. They'll reduce inflammation, they're lowering intensity, maybe lower volume. Even if you continue to do that, you should get stronger for weeks and weeks and weeks after the show, literally just by like reducing fatigue and eating more.
Yeah.
And your body weight goes up, so you have more leverage in the gym, like especially like in the bottom of the lifts and stuff. Joints are a little more cushion, stuff like that. So there's no reason that you can't make progress without just beating the crap out of yourself. So the nice thing about that, and that's kind of like a goal for me with a lot of people, is we can make as much progress that way as possible, and at the same time the stress load is low enough that all the other stuff's still recovering in the background. By the time we need to increase the training, like intensity and all that stuff back up, hormones are already mostly fixed. So, and I think in that study, again, I'm like citing that, and there might be others. It took several months for everything to be fixed. Now they measured some other stuff too. I know they measured like cortisol and testosterone. They might even have measured leptin. Again, I wish I remembered this stuff. It was older. It's like probably 2016 or something. But it was something like 6 months to like for every metric to come back to normal, something ridiculous like that. And you got to think these are probably people that are relatively regimented, even post show. I mean, these are seasoned people, and I imagine like it was relatively controlled as much as they could as far as like the variables in the study. So, and that's a man, that's a guy. That's not
Yeah.
even a woman, you know. So now, where I think it, where I think people make a mental error there is they feel better, so they assume that they're better, but everything feels better than where you were. So it's like, it's like when you're sick. That's kind of the example I use for people. It's like when you're sick, when you're sick and how when you feel better after you're sick, you feel like the best you've ever
For
had. You
real.
ever had that feeling?
Oh yeah.
You're like, it's the best feeling because it's you feel better, but you're also very relieved.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's just such a good feeling. You're ready. You're
Mhm.
ready to go. And so it's kind of like that. It's
Yeah.
kind of like I felt like crap for so long that everything feels better. When in reality, you're still nowhere close to 100%.
Yeah.
So that's where yes, adding calories, yes, adding body fat, but also still being mindful of the nervous system and everything in that process as far as like how you're training as well.
Yeah.
And that can vary person to person. Everyone feels better at a different rate. A lot of it'll depend on the person and their environment and how hard they had to push in the prep. And, if you really had to grind super, super hard, it's going to take a while. Anyone that's really had to do that, they know. It's not like, oh, prep's over. You're like, oh, shit, I still don't feel that good. Because what happens is the first few days you're excited, so you're riding that,
Yeah.
and people, and it's funny because a lot of time what'll happen is they start talking to me about their goals and like their feelings about it and all that stuff. Say, hey, let's talk in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
I was like, right now, I want you to get back on track, get some free meals, like let's get this shit out of the way. Let's revisit the mental aspect in 2 weeks when reality hits.
Yeah.
And let's see how you feel. Because then they get the post show blues and they don't have the goal and and all that stuff. that's more accurate as far as how you're actually feeling. You're like, I still feel like I'm in prep, kind of.
Yeah.
Other than, you're starting to eat more, but physically, you still feel like you're in prep. Now, the other thing there too is hunger. When you start introducing food and they know their hunger's going up and stuff, sometimes you're trying to restrict the calories or the rate of regain so much that they binge and they go off plan and all this stuff. And so your base plan doesn't really mean anything. All you're doing is kind of just trying to offset the fact that you're overeating 2, 3, 4 times a week or every day, ever at night or something. So you might even be just better off. Like if I start seeing that pattern, like we just need to bump the base plan up high enough to where you can stick to it. Because when you start binging like that and start doing those things, I mean, if you were a female eating 1,000 calories at the end or 1,200 calories or whatever, and your initial off-season plan, let's say you go all the way up to 2,000 calories, but you screw up like 3 or 4 times a week. I don't want to say screw up. You go off plan 3 or 4 times a week. You know how easy it is to eat 1,000 calories in a sitting.
Yeah, pretty
Especially
easy.
especially when you got treats and stuff. If you
Yeah.
got treats in the house, you're doing that stuff. Dude, that don't matter. That 2,000 calories means like absolutely nothing because you literally ate 4,000 on one day or 3,000. Maybe you were good on all of your meals except one and you really went overboard. It's I mean, it's out the window at that point, so you might as well just try to raise that base plan up and get it to where you can actually stick to it because now I can see like what does your weight look like? What does your body fat look like? Like how do you feel? I have something I can consistently look at that point. Because otherwise you're doing the binge, you do the overeating thing, we wait 3 days, it finally comes back to normal. Hopefully you didn't binge again in 3 days. And then we restart. And we're like, all right. But then you do it again. And so it gets hard. So sometimes when that's like a recurring pattern, you're you know, better off just dealing with it and just bumping the calories up and trying to maintain. And so that's where that process is still very intuitive and it's very by feel. Everybody thinks they're going to be fine, but hardly anyone's ever fine. That's the thing.
Very true.
That is the thing, dude. I've done because I have competed, I don't know, 12, 13, 14 times, something like that. I pretty much know after the show what my body's going to feel like and what my hunger cues and stuff are going to feel like. And if I start getting that, I'm like, nope, calories going up tomorrow.
Yeah.
Because you start getting in that pattern, and then mentally you feel defeated, and you have to check in, and you got to do all that stuff, and hopefully you're not lying to your coach and whatever.
Yeah.
And and then also that's not even taking into account the fact that it's probably like junky food that's maybe, again, science people are going to smack me, but it's like inflammatory. And now granted, the food selection itself is not the problem so much as the fact that you're continuously eating large boluses of food that are quote unquote like highly processed or void of a lot of nutrients and things like that. So doing that repetitively could be kind of hard on your body, could be hard on your gut. I would be probably most concerned about like GI health with a lot of those people because your digestion's already kind of like down regulated for lack of better terms. It's not been exposed to a whole lot, so like your microbial diversity is probably a little bit low. You got real low calories, so you were only eating like a few different foods because that's all that you could afford to eat. And if you were lucky enough to afford more variety, like awesome, but some people aren't at the end. And now you're introducing all this stuff in there that and your microbiome's already very, very like stunted. And then now you start having GI issues post show. And I actually see this a lot where people maybe have like a little bit of slowdown, slight constipation, something like that pre-show from the stress, right? Motility slows down, but you're not really seeing the GI issues that much. But then post-show, I have a problem. Like, nah, you probably already had a problem. It's just now you're cramming a bunch of stuff into this broken system and it can't, you know, process it,
Yeah.
right? So it was there. It's just now you're actually seeing it because of that. So that's why no matter what, even if you have to raise things faster than you want, there has to be some kind of control in there for it to work.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I imagine like having control too is there's like a psychological aspect to it as well. I mean, like you mentioned, if you're not raising them high enough, then someone's binging, and then there's like that shame factor having to check in, and so it's like you might as well just raise them up so there's no like secrets and
Yeah. Well, is eating disorder, that's a negative adaptation, right?
yeah, and that happens for
That's a
sure.
really bad one. We'll call that a consequence. That is a side effect. That is an adaptation that can kind of occur. Is just that relationship, the psychological turmoil that that can cause, and you start trying to do the restrict thing to offset your mistakes, and no one thinks it's going to happen to them,
Yeah.
and then it does. And I'll be honest, like full transparency, there's plenty of habits because you pick up these weird habits pre-show anyhow,
Yeah.
right? Or when you get real deep in the diet, you pick up weird habits. You do like your food selection gets weird. You know, you're probably doing a lot of like too much sweetener. You know, I don't know. There's like a bunch of things trying to
Yeah.
eat more vegetables, like all these things. But those things can get way out of hand once once you're out of the show, and because now you don't even have this show to kind of keep you in check. So you get 6 months in and you're like, oh no, like I legitimately have some kind of disordered eating pattern going
Yeah.
on. And that's why I think hunger is actually like a really, really good marker post show, because once I get to the point where people think their hunger is stable, so when I say stable, you eat a meal, you're satiated until your next meal, and you're not really craving much or anything between meals. That would probably indicate that you're getting pretty close to like a homeostatic state at that point. Because if not, if you're still having those things, your body's telling you something. It's trying to get you to eat,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So hunger's a really good one there.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, do you have you noticed that there's like almost adaptation from show to show? So like for example, like I competed in 2020. I feel like my hunger dissipated pretty quickly, and then like the last show I did in 2023, like my appetite stayed pretty high for a good amount of time, which I was like actually happy about. Got a little scared for a second. I was like, "Damn, am
Yeah. Oh
I
no.
broken? This is how it happens." Okay, um, but like it felt better to be like I don't hate food already. So like, does your body kind of adjust in that scenario, or is it maybe I just had more muscle the second time around, so my metabolic rate naturally was higher, and it took a bit more to put my body fat where it was needed to be, or something. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean that happens. We know that is a factor. That's one of those things though. It's kind of similar to refeeding. It doesn't have that much effect. People are like, oh, I got a lot more muscle. Yeah, if you weigh 150 versus 250, big difference. But 2 pounds of muscle doesn't increase your metabolic rate that much.
Yeah,
You know, a lot of the time when people go through prep and or go through a diet phase or something, and let's say they get to the end of it and they get to the same or better point of leanness with less restriction, there's something completely unrelated than muscle helping you. You were less stressed, you know, you had like better strategies throughout. You did something different, because I can tell you I've had differences in that, and I've competed in so many different sizes, everywhere from 100 and 49, 48 pounds all the way up to 200 pounds and stuff, and largely ended prep at almost the same spot. And now, granted, it's a little bit better. And granted, I, for whatever reason, whether it's like genetic or what, tend to adapt a lot. But so that might be a little more extreme than some people. But it's not like you go through a couple 1-2 year off season, put on few pounds of tissue, and then all of a sudden you're going to diet on like 1,000 more calories. Like, it doesn't.
Yeah.
It generally doesn't happen like that. So probably most likely there was something else, like environment or something that was maybe just a little bit better, that allowed you to, digestion was a little better, something like that, that allowed you to have that effect.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think probably for me it was probably digestion. If I think back, because I remember it was a struggle to hit 150 pounds. I think it was like 2020 on my birthday, hit 150, and I was stoked about it. And now I'm just like, now it's hard to get under 150. It's just like,
Yeah.
oh, but yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Cool.
anyways, I know you. I know you have to
Yeah.
go.
And a
So
bounce.
we'll wrap up here. But thanks so much for coming back
Yeah.
on. All the stuff is
Thank you.
super helpful and good information for folks, especially when it comes to the adaptations. And I'm always trying to people like there's those folks that think that eating less is better sometimes, and you're like, no, 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 like eat your calories because you will adapt too quickly, and it's
Yeah.
not going to be fun moving forward. So,
Um, if you don't mind, and I don't think you'll mind, I'm gonna plug something real quick.
oh, go for
So
it.
so actually, if you guys go to, I am Austin Stout on Facebook, or I am Austin ST the number 8 on Instagram. If you go to my bio, the link tree in there, it gives you like all the links to all my stuff. I have a merch, or not a merch store. I have a education store. I actually have a whole class in there about literally tons of refeeding and diet breaking strategies, and how to utilize each scenario and when and why. So it's a video class. It's inexpensive. So like it gives you all that practical information. So if you guys are actually like coaching people or trying to do this stuff yourself, that might be something for like a lower cost of entry, where you can learn a bunch of that stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Do it.
So
You're my
there you go.
mentor. I highly recommend your educational resources. So definitely check that out. Do you want to plug your socials, like Instagram
Yeah.
and stuff
Well,
too?
so those were my socials that I
Oh,
gave you.
yeah.
So,
Sorry.
so basically, yeah, I mean, basically, if you go to my bio in there in the link tree, it'll kind of connect you with everything. My email's in there for any inquiries. All the other resources are in the link tree. So if you click that, you'll get it's all listed out.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much again. And
Yeah. Thank you.
we'll have to do this again sometime if you're up for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you having me. I'll talk to you again soon.
All right. Peace out.
Later.